Just a few hours after ordering 1,000 more troops to the Middle East in the midst of rising tensions with Iran, the president, who you see there standing at the podium for his re-election rally, we're monitoring that for news, the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, who he ordered those troops to go to the Middle East, announced he's stepping down after revelations about domestic violence incidents involving his son and ex-wife more than 7 years ago. Shanahan's tenure as acting secretary already set a record for the longest the country's gone without a Senate-confirmed Secretary of Defense. And now with his withdrawal, the vacancy is likely to continue indefinitely at a time when the Trump administration is blaming Iran for attacks on Middle East shipping and threatening to retaliate. The leadership vacuum at the Pentagon has left an opening for some of the president's most bellicose advisors who've been pushing action against Iran for years. One of those advisors, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, just paid a personal visit to U.S. Central Command, known as CENTCOM, which oversees the U.S. military in the Middle East. He did this despite the fact the Secretary of State has no role in the Defense Department's chain of command. According to Pompeo, the president has no desire to go to war.
We have been engaged in many messages, even this moment right here, communicating to Iran that we are there to deter aggression. President Trump does not want war, and we will continue to communicate that message while doing the things that are necessary to protect American interests in the region.
I'm joined now by former Secretary of Defense William Cohn. Mr. Secretary, does it matter that there is not a confirmed Secretary of Defense?
I think it matters that there is a lack of continuity in the office, yes. Whenever you continue to have a churning of personnel, a new acting secretary will then want to bring his own people in. And so you have this constant churning of personnel and the question of which direction they need to go. So I think it's not healthy to continue to have this. I hope the new acting secretary will be confirmed as the Secretary of Defense. So he establishes his own staff and personnel and consultants that help him navigate his way through. But in terms of whether we're still prepared to conduct our security affairs, you've got the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chairman Dunford, who is highly, highly respected. I think that Secretary Pompeo was trying to walk this issue back somewhat. And we've been down this road before. You may recall with North Korea, the president was threatening fire and fury. And then he ended up having love letters being exchanged. But you had Secretary Mattis there as sort of a counselor, and you don't have a Secretary Mattis there at this particular point. So that's of concern.
That you hit on something that I've been looking at. I mean, today you had the Secretary of State at CENTCOM. I don't think I've ever seen the Secretary of State answering questions outside CENTCOM in the midst of escalating military tensions. What did you think of that?
I'm not sure I've ever seen it either, but I can tell you that Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and I worked very closely together, and it's really important that state and defense be on the same page as far as whether we're going to war, what the message is going to be, and trying to walk it back. And one of the problems is that the president has been conducting what I call megaphone diplomacy. And the problem with that is if you keep using that megaphone, you back yourself into a corner and the other adversary into a corner. It makes it very hard to come back to the center of the ring where you try to resolve it peacefully. So I don't think it's a healthy process to keep using that diplomacy. I think the Secretary Pompeo is trying to be helpful, just as Secretary Rex Tillerson was, and also Jim Mattis. I think there is some element there that's trying to hold him back as far as defense and state are concerned, whether that's coming out of the White House or not with John Bolton, and whether the president really is encouraging them to increase the rhetoric remains an issue for me.
Well, but isn't there a kind of internal logic to this kind of escalation? I mean, what you just said about sort of trapping yourself and your adversary as well in this cycle. It does seem to me there's obviously a kind of inertial push towards some kind of military confrontation. It's very clear.
Yeah, one of the problems is the president said, just give me a call. We can resolve this and back down once you give me a call. And, of course, the Iranians are going to say, wait a minute, I'm not calling you. You're right. The one who's escalating it. So who's going to save face here? Does the president really want to push this to the next step? And here's another issue. If you have Plan A, which means we're going to get out of the agreement, we're going to intensify sanctions until they break, then what is Plan B when they don't break? Is the only option left to continue to increase sanctions when you may not have the support of all the allies you've been insulting over the years who want to do business with Iran? Or do you then have a military option and you go back and say, in return for what you've done in the Gulf, we're going to do the following to some of your ships or to your naval assets? That's the problem right now, where the Iranians may feel emboldened that we may be in a period of confusion or chaotic kind of change of command, because the Secretary of Defense is number 2 in that chain of command, where they may do something that's thoroughly stupid, and that will cause a reaction on our part to just do some real damage.
Can I ask a question that I don't feel I have a good hold on? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the assertions by the administration, they say relying on American intelligence, the attacks on tankers have been done by forces under the influence of the Iranians, whether those are Houthi rebels or others. Let's say that's the case. I don't know if it is, but let's say it's the case. What is the mental model of what the Iranians are doing and why they're doing this? It doesn't add up to me. Like, what do people think they're doing?
Well, I think the Iranians have for some time, they've been a revolutionary government as such. They seek to expand their influence in the region. I have no doubt that they continue to support the Houthis, who are launching attacks against the Saudis, who are engaged in activities, the Iranians, through proxies in Lebanon and Syria, certainly in Iraq. So I have no doubt that they want to continue to be expansionists by their very nature. The question is, how far can they continue to go without provoking a real substantial response by us, and hopefully, if there is one, by our allies joining in? So they're trying to stay under the radar and still cause us problems, do things which kill people. I go back to Khobar Tower, and they were involved, in my opinion, in the killing of many, many people during that time. So I don't have any doubt that they are continuing to try to use proxies and their own Revolutionary Guard forces to try to be disruptive, to cause difficulties and tempt us to do something which would then justify all of the other parties in the region to come down against the United States. Right. I would say one more thing. I think it's really dangerous for us to think there can be 1 or 2 military strikes and it's over. We've been down that road. You remember, Iraq was going to be a cakewalk. We'd be using all of their oil, which would be ours. We're still in Iraq. We're still in Afghanistan. So 1 or 2 strikes won't do it. And I think if you're going to take military action, you better be prepared for a long time.
All right, former Defense Secretary William Cohen, thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.